My name is Luciana Hawthorne. I'm 33 years old. And the morning my family showed up at my front door, after 7 years of pretending I didn't exist, I was elbow deep in grease, rebuilding the carburetor of a vintage Mustang engine I'd been restoring for weeks. The timing felt almost insulting. My workshop sits a good distance from the main house, by design. It's where I think best, where the noise in my head finally quiets. High ceilings, concrete floors, tools arranged exactly where I need them. No voices, no judgment, just the low hum of work done right. That morning was a Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. No appointments, no meetings, no reason for anyone to be on my property. So when my security system chimed, sharp and insistent, I didn't look up right away. I assumed it was a delivery truck that had missed the signage again. That happened occasionally. The second chime made me pause. I wiped my hands on a rag and pulled up the camera feed on my phone. And my stomach dropped. Standing at the end of my circular driveway, right where the iron gates curve inward, were 6 people who hadn't acknowledged my existence in 7 years. My grandmother Dorothy, my Aunt Rachel and Uncle Paul, my cousins Carter and Logan, and my older brother Nathan, standing slightly apart, with a woman I didn't recognize gripping his arm like she belonged there. They looked tentative, which would have been laughable if it hadn't been so deeply unsettling. For a moment, I genuinely considered pretending I wasn't home, letting them stand there until embarrassment finally sent them away. These were the same people who'd erased me from family photos, who'd stopped inviting me to holidays, who'd referred to me, when they referred to me at all, as the one who didn't pan out. But something in their body language stopped me. They weren't here to reconnect. They were here because they needed something. I watched as they arrived in 2 vehicles. Nathan's aging Ford Focus, paint dulled by years of neglect, and a budget rental that screamed Uncle Paul's idea of temporary necessity. They'd been hovering near my front steps for nearly 10 minutes before anyone worked up the nerve to ring the bell. Through the camera, I saw whispered arguments, glances exchanged, my grandmother adjusting her purse strap like she was bracing for combat. The unfamiliar woman, Nathan's wife, I assumed, snapping photos of the house with her phone, probably already imagining how it would look posted online. To understand why this visit felt surreal, you need to understand how we got here. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Memphis. Modest house, predictable routines, predictable expectations. My father, Robert, supervised loading docks at FedEx. My mother, Susan, worked part-time managing a dental practice. They weren't cruel people, but they believed in one very narrow version of success. College, office job, benefits, suburban home, retirement. Anything outside that mold was considered failure by default. My brother Nathan fit that mold perfectly. Straight A student, student council, full ride to Vanderbilt for business administration, the family's pride and joy. Every accomplishment celebrated like a national holiday. And then there was me. The daughter who tore up the backyard designing gardens instead of playing house. The teenager who built structures instead of memorizing formulas. The girl who saw possibility where everyone else saw dirt. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When Nathan brought home report cards, there were steakhouse dinners and phone calls to relatives. When I brought home something I'd built, like the Japanese rock garden I designed for my mother's birthday after 2 months of planning, the response was always the same. "That's lovely, Lucy. Did you finish your chemistry homework?" Every Sunday meant dinner at my grandmother Dorothy's house. She ruled the family with velvet-covered iron fists, ranking grandchildren like contestants in a competition none of us had agreed to enter. Nathan always sat beside her, front and center, entertaining the table with tales of internships and future promotions. I was usually squeezed between younger cousins at what might as well have been the children's table, even when I was nearly an adult. By 16, the divide was impossible to ignore. While Nathan was thriving at Vanderbilt, I was working landscaping jobs under the table, earning more in a weekend than most adults in my family made in a month. By senior year, I'd saved over $20,000. Instead of pride, my parents felt embarrassment. When I told them I wasn't going to college, the fallout was nuclear. My father threatened to kick me out. My mother cried for days, calling me ungrateful for rejecting opportunities they'd never had. But it was my grandmother's words that changed everything. "Luciana," she said that night, cornering me near the grill, "this phase needs to end. You're embarrassing the family. Nathan has a real future. You're just playing in the dirt." That was the moment I stopped trying to belong. I moved out the following week, and 7 years later, they were standing on my doorstep, suddenly remembering I existed. I set my phone down, washed my hands, and walked toward the front door. My boots echoed against marble floors as I crossed the entryway I'd designed myself. When I opened the door, their faces told me everything. They hadn't expected this. "Luciana," my grandmother said first, forcing warmth into her voice. "What a beautiful home." I met her gaze calmly. "Hard work pays off," I said. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. And that was when I knew. Whatever brought them here was about to change everything. I didn't invite them inside right away. I stood in the doorway longer than was polite, letting the moment stretch, letting the discomfort settle into their bones. For 7 years, silence had been their weapon. I'd learned patience the hard way. Finally, I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. "You've already made the trip." They filed past me like guests entering a museum, slow, cautious, eyes darting everywhere. The foyer alone was enough to unsteady them. 20-foot ceilings, hand-forged ironwork, imported stone beneath their feet, warmed by radiant heating. The chandelier overhead wasn't flashy, but it was unmistakably expensive. Everything in my house was intentional, built to last, built without asking permission. Carter let out a low whistle he didn't bother hiding. "Wow," he muttered. "Lucy, this place is insane." I closed the door behind them and locked it. Not for safety, but for symbolism. "You haven't even seen the rest," I replied evenly. As they stood there, pretending to admire craftsmanship, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting backward. Because this wasn't just about today. It never was. This was about a lifetime of being quietly dismissed. Growing up, I learned early that families don't always wound loudly. Sometimes they do it through omission, through what they praise, through what they ignore. Nathan was praised constantly. If he scored well on a test, it was proof of his destiny. If he struggled, it was because the system hadn't challenged him enough. Every flaw was reframed as potential. With me, effort was invisible unless it fit their narrative. I remember being 12, spending an entire summer redesigning our backyard. I researched plants, learned soil composition, mapped sunlight patterns. I dug, planted, built raised beds with my own hands. When it was done, neighbors stopped to stare. My father glanced out the window once and said, "Looks neat." That was it. At family dinners, the comparisons were constant. Not always direct, but sharp enough to cut. Nathan's professor thinks he's management material. Nathan's internship could turn into something big. Then, inevitably, someone would turn to me. "So, Lucy, still into plants?" Like it was a phase, like I'd grow out of it. My grandmother Dorothy was the worst of them, but also the most honest. She never bothered disguising her disappointment. She believed in hierarchy, in rankings, in appearances. At Sunday dinners, she'd seat us according to perceived potential. Nathan always at her side. Cousins Carter and Logan floated somewhere in the middle, good enough to tolerate, not impressive enough to celebrate. I was the cautionary tale. "She's creative," Dorothy would say, lips tight. "You know what that usually means." Everyone did. It meant unreliable. It meant unstable. It meant future burden. When I started working landscaping jobs in high school, the money didn't impress them. Only the optics mattered. Manual labor embarrassed them. Dirt under my nails was a stain they couldn't scrub out. My mother would lie when neighbors asked about my weekends. "She's just helping a friend," she'd say quickly. "You know, keeping busy." As if the truth that her daughter was building something real was shameful. The tension finally exploded the night I announced I wasn't going to college. The living room felt like a courtroom. My parents on one side, me on the other. "You're throwing your life away," my father said, voice tight with fury. "You're being selfish," my mother sobbed. "We sacrificed everything for you." No one asked what I wanted. No one asked what I'd built already. And then came my grandmother's lecture, the one that burned itself into my memory. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply told me I was an embarrassment. That was the moment I understood something crucial. Love in this family was conditional. So I left. I rented a converted garage from a coworker, 400 square feet, a kitchenette barely large enough to turn around in, a bathroom the size of a closet. And I felt freer there than I ever had in my childhood bedroom. While Nathan finished college surrounded by applause, I learned everything from the ground up: soil science, irrigation systems, hardscape engineering, business permits, client management. I worked until my hands ached and my back screamed. When I came to family gatherings, the tone shifted. Uncle Paul would clap my shoulder and joke, "Well, someone's got to take care of the lawns, right?" Aunt Rachel asked if I was still doing the gardening thing. Carter and Logan, barely scraping by themselves, made jokes about me being the family's outdoor help. And every time I smiled. Because arguing would have required believing they were capable of hearing me. The breaking point came when I was 25. Nathan landed an entry-level accounting job making $52,000 a year. The family acted like he'd won the lottery. That same month, I launched my own company, Sterling Landscapes. I'd planned it for years, saved relentlessly, took a loan against my truck, put everything I had into it. At Christmas dinner, I made the mistake of sharing my biggest contract yet, a 6-figure deal that would change everything. "That's nice," Aunt Rachel said, eyes glued to her phone. "But what about stability?" Uncle Paul added. "Landscaping is risky." Then my grandmother leaned back in her chair, surveying me like a failed experiment. "When are you going to grow up, Luciana?" she asked. "Nathan's buying a house. You're still playing outside." Playing. That word followed me for years. I left early that night, and something inside me hardened. I stopped attending birthdays, stopped showing up uninvited, stopped chasing approval that was never coming. When Nathan got engaged, I offered to help with the wedding. I genuinely wanted to. "Thanks," he said politely, "but we've got it covered." At the engagement party, I was seated with strangers. When Nathan gave his speech, he thanked everyone. Bosses, professors, friends. He didn't mention me once. That was the last thread. From that moment on, I disappeared from their lives the same way they'd erased me from theirs. Quietly, completely. And now, standing in my living room years later, watching their eyes widen as they took in what I'd built, I realized they weren't shocked by my success. They were shocked that I'd succeeded without them. There's a moment in every long-burning story when the fire finally finds oxygen. For me, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with slammed doors or shouted goodbyes. It came with clarity. After that Christmas dinner, the one where my success was politely dismissed and quietly mocked, I drove back to my apartment in silence. No music, no phone calls, just the steady hum of tires against asphalt and the realization that I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. Sterling Landscapes had just launched, and the fear was constant. I lay awake most nights staring at the ceiling, running numbers in my head, equipment costs, payroll, insurance, permits. One bad month could wipe me out. One client backing out could end everything. But the fear felt honest. It felt earned. I'd spent 6 years working at Greenscape Solutions, learning every part of the business from the ground up. My boss trusted me enough to hand over entire projects. I estimated jobs, managed crews, handled suppliers, dealt with angry clients and impossible timelines. When I finally left, he didn't call me reckless. He shook my hand and said, "You're ready." That single sentence meant more than anything my family had said in years. The early months of Sterling Landscapes were brutal. I worked 18-hour days, sometimes longer. I did everything: sales, design, labor, cleanup, invoicing. I learned quickly which clients to avoid and which ones were worth bending over backward for. My first major breakthrough came unexpectedly. A neglected Victorian mansion on the edge of town, overgrown hedges, collapsing stonework, gardens swallowed by weeds. The owners wanted to sell, but the property looked forgotten. I redesigned the entire grounds, restored symmetry, rebuilt paths, chose plants that honored the home's age without trapping it in the past. When we finished, the transformation was staggering. Before and after photos spread fast. Realtors shared them. Designers called. Suddenly, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. That project didn't just pay my bills. It changed how people saw me, except my family. At gatherings I still attended, out of habit, more than hope, the dynamic hadn't shifted. If anything, the condescension had become more refined. Uncle Paul started asking business questions that weren't actually questions at all. They were traps, doubts disguised as concern. "You've got insurance, right? What happens when your back gives out?" Manual work doesn't last forever. I stopped answering. When Nathan talked about his job, everyone leaned in. When I spoke, they nodded politely and changed the subject. The message was clear. No matter how hard I worked, it would never count. The final break came at Nathan's engagement party. By then, Sterling Landscapes was generating serious money. Not flashy, not public, but steady. real. I'd offered to contribute to the wedding because I believed, stupidly, that generosity might soften something. Instead, I was seated with distant acquaintances while Nathan's college friends occupied the main table. When he gave his speech, 10 full minutes of gratitude, he thanked everyone except me. That night, I watched the version of myself that still hoped for recognition finally die. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I simply stopped trying. Over the next 4 years, I became ruthlessly focused. Sterling Landscapes grew from 3 people and a truck into a full-scale operation. I hired carefully, paid well, treated my crew like professionals because they were. We specialized in high-end residential and commercial projects, clients who valued quality and didn't flinch at premium pricing. I reinvested everything. No flashy cars, no social media bragging. Same reliable truck, same modest apartment. While Nathan bought a house he couldn't afford and filled it with furniture purchased on credit, I built something quieter, stronger. I didn't go to family holidays. No one noticed. That hurt at first. Then it didn't. I built friendships outside bloodlines, other business owners, designers, contractors, people who respected competence more than appearances. When one of my project managers had his basement flood, the entire crew showed up that weekend to rebuild it. No invoices, no hesitation. That was family. When the pandemic hit, everything shifted again. Landscaping was deemed essential work. While most businesses shut down, mine exploded. People trapped at home wanted outdoor spaces. Restaurants needed patios built overnight. Offices needed redesigns focused on wellness. We adapted fast. Estimated Monday, built Wednesday. While larger firms got buried in bureaucracy, we stayed lean and responsive. Clients paid premiums for speed and quality. By 2022, Sterling Landscapes was generating multiple millions annually. I bought land, 8 acres outside Nashville, not to show off, but to build something permanent. Something that would last. The house took months to design. Southern architecture with modern bones, built for longevity, not trends. The workshop alone was larger than most homes. I moved in quietly. And still, my family had no idea. They thought I was still doing the gardening thing. Nathan's life, meanwhile, was unraveling. His mortgage was underwater, credit cards maxed. His wife, Amanda, had expensive tastes and no income. When his firm downsized, she left him for a lawyer who represented her in the divorce. I heard about it through mutual acquaintances, never from him. I didn't reach out. Not out of spite, out of acceptance. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. I was at a hardware store when I noticed someone staring. Logan's girlfriend. She recognized my truck, followed me on social media later, saw the project photos, the equipment, the house in the background. The truth traveled fast after that. Suddenly, after years of silence, texts started appearing. Hope you're doing well. Incredible work. Let's catch up. Family should stay connected. I ignored every message, because by then I understood something they never had. They didn't miss me. They missed access. And a week later, they showed up at my door. By the time my family finally realized I existed again, my life had already outgrown every box they'd ever tried to put me in. They just hadn't bothered to look. Standing in my living room that morning, watching them absorb the scale of what surrounded them, I saw something flicker behind their eyes. Confusion first, then recalculation. They were doing math. The kind that doesn't involve numbers, but value. "What do you do now, exactly?" Carter asked, trying to sound casual as his gaze drifted from the floor-to-ceiling windows to the stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. I smiled politely. "The same thing I've always done," I said. "I build." That answer didn't satisfy them. It never had. I led them further inside, partly because I was curious how far their composure would stretch, and partly because I wanted to see the truth settle in. The living room opened into the kitchen, where a custom island anchored the space like a piece of sculpture. Professional, grade appliances gleamed under soft lighting. Everything was functional, but nothing was cheap. Logan pulled out his phone and started taking photos. He didn't even try to hide it. "This place must have cost a fortune," he muttered. "More than you make in 4 years?" I replied evenly. He laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. As we moved through the house, their reactions became harder to mask. The office lined with awards and framed project photos. The workshop equipped better than most design firms. The pond outside, engineered, landscaped, alive. Each room peeled back another layer of the narrative they'd built about me. The failure, the disappointment, the cautionary tale. My grandmother said very little. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if afraid that if she acknowledged what she was seeing too loudly, it might vanish. And that silence told me everything. By the time we returned to the living room and sat down with coffee, the atmosphere had shifted. The small talk felt forced. Everyone was circling the same question without asking it outright.
How much?
How successful? How valuable are you now? I answered their questions with restraint, just enough detail to be unmistakable. Yes, the company's doing well. Yes, we're booked out for 2 years. Yes, I have full-time employees, benefits, equipment. No bragging, no exaggeration, just facts. That was when Aunt Rachel cleared her throat. The sound hit my nerves like a warning bell. Luciana, she began carefully, we've all been thinking a lot about family lately. I leaned back in my chair and waited. She glanced at Nathan, then continued. He's been going through some things. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. His hands were clasped too tightly in his lap. The woman beside him, his wife then, kept her eyes on the coffee cup like it might offer instructions. What kind of things? I asked calmly. The divorce, Rachel said. Legal fees. Settlements. You know how complicated these things can get. I did know. I also knew they hadn't come all this way to share emotional updates. Uncle Paul jumped in next, eager. Actually, Lucy, I've been looking into some investment opportunities. Landscaping adjacent. With your expertise, your connections, there could be something here, something that benefits the whole family. There it was. Not a request. A strategy. They weren't asking for help. They were positioning themselves to deserve it. I watched them closely as they spoke, how their words softened around the edges, how the narrative subtly shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the embarrassment anymore. I was a resource, a solution, a missing puzzle piece. My grandmother finally spoke. We've missed you, she said. It's time to put the past behind us. Families don't stay apart forever. The audacity of it took my breath away. For 7 years, I hadn't received a single invitation. Not a birthday card, not a phone call. Nathan had married and divorced without telling me. And now, sitting in my living room, surrounded by evidence of everything they'd dismissed, they wanted reconciliation, on their terms. I set my coffee down and looked at them one by one. Remind me, I said quietly, when was the last family gathering I was invited to? Silence. They exchanged glances. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. You know how busy life gets, she said finally. No, I replied. I don't. Explain it to me. The air shifted. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. Nathan finally spoke up. Luciana, I know we haven't been close. Close? I interrupted. You didn't tell me you got married or divorced. I found out from someone else. You sat across from me at dinners and pretended I didn't exist. His face flushed. And now, I continued, my voice steady, you're standing in my house asking for help like nothing happened. My grandmother's lips pressed into a thin line. We all make mistakes. Some mistakes last 7 years, I said. I stood then, not aggressively, just decisively. You want to know what family looks like to me? I asked. It's people who show up before there's money involved, before there's something to gain. They had no answer. One by one, they rose from their seats. The visit ended not with shouting or tears, but with something far worse, understanding. As they moved toward the door, Nathan hesitated. Lucy, he said softly, some things are worth rebuilding. I met his gaze. Some things are, I agreed, and some things were never real to begin with. I opened the door. They left without another word. And as the house fell quiet again, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel angry. I felt free. After the door closed behind them, the house felt different. Not quieter. Quieter had been my normal for years, but settled. Like something unfinished had finally reached its natural end. I stood there for a long moment, hands still resting against the solid oak door, listening to the faint crunch of gravel as their cars pulled away down the long drive. No one looked back. No one waved. Whatever story they'd rehearsed on the way here had collapsed under the weight of reality. I didn't lock the door immediately. I walked back into the living room instead, past the coffee cups they hadn't finished, past the couch where my grandmother had sat stiffly, trying to reconcile the woman I'd become with the girl she'd written off. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air, illuminating the space I'd built piece by piece, with no one's permission but my own. For the first time since they arrived, I let myself breathe. People like to believe confrontations bring closure in a single dramatic moment, that once you say the right words, everything settles neatly into place. That's not how it works. Closure doesn't come from what you say to others. It comes from what you finally stop saying to yourself. For years, a part of me had quietly waited for that knock on the door, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted confirmation. Proof that my absence had mattered. That someone, somewhere in that family, had noticed the space I left behind. Now I knew the truth. They hadn't come because they missed me. They came because the math had changed. Because the girl they'd dismissed had become inconveniently successful. Because the narrative they'd told themselves for years, that I'd fail, that I'd crawl back, that I'd eventually prove them right, had shattered beyond repair. I poured the remaining coffee down the sink and rinsed the cups, the simple domestic act grounding me. Outside, the pond reflected the sky perfectly, undisturbed. The koi moved lazily beneath the surface, oblivious to human drama. I envied them. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from Nathan. "Lucy, I know today was a lot. I just want you to know I am proud of you. I always have been. I just didn't know how to say it." I stared at the screen for a long time. 7 years ago, a message like that would have shattered me. I would have dissected every word, searching for sincerity, clinging to the possibility that something had been misunderstood all along. Now it landed differently. Pride, spoken only after success, isn't pride. It's revision. I didn't reply. Instead, I powered my phone off and went back to the workshop. There was still work to do. The Mustang engine sat exactly where I'd left it, patient and unfinished. I slid my gloves back on, the familiar weight calming. Metal doesn't pretend. It either fits or it doesn't. It either works or it fails. There's honesty in that. As I tightened bolts and adjusted timing, my mind wandered, not backward, but forward. I thought about the crew meeting scheduled for the next morning, about a new project breaking ground next week, about the expansion plans we'd been mapping out for Memphis, about the apprentice I'd hired recently, eager, curious, hungry in the way I'd been at her age. I thought about my boyfriend, Evan, who'd been out of town on a site visit and had trusted me enough not to pry when I told him my family might show up unexpectedly. He'd learned early not to ask questions unless I offered answers. Respect like that still surprised me sometimes. Family, I'd learned, wasn't about blood. It was about consistency, about who shows up when there's nothing to gain, about who listens without ranking you against someone else. As evening settled over the property, I walked the perimeter of the land, checking lighting, listening to cicadas hum as dusk fell. The house behind me glowed warm and steady, no longer a symbol of success, but simply home. I thought about my grandmother, how she'd looked at me toward the end, less judgmental than confused, as if she'd realized too late that the rules she'd enforced so ruthlessly no longer applied to the world we lived in. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. Some bridges are worth rebuilding. Others are worth letting collapse, because crossing them again would only lead you back to places you worked too hard to escape. That night I slept deeply. No dreams of old arguments, no replaying conversations in my head, just rest. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee, and stood on the porch watching the sun rise over land that belonged to me. Not just legally, but emotionally. Every inch of it represented a choice I'd made when walking away felt terrifying and staying felt impossible. I didn't know what story my family would tell after this. Maybe they'd paint me as cold, ungrateful, changed by money. I didn't care, because for the first time, my story belonged entirely to me. And if they ever wondered what it cost to finally call me family again, the answer was simple. Everything they refused to give when it mattered.